And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View. And as we've been talking about all week, we are privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Erwin Lutzer, an individual is the pastor emeritus of Moody Church, served as senior pastor for 36 years, author of so many different books, 1 Minute After You Die, Hitler's Cross. But the book that I've been recommending for really almost a year now, it came out in November, and it's entitled We Will Not Be Silenced. Dr. David Jeremiah, I love what he says. If I could put this book in the hands of every Christian in America, I would. And so this really addresses many of the cultural issues we talk about here on Point of View. And we're just privileged to have Dr. Erwin Lutzer in studio with us today. Thank you for joining us.
So glad to be with you today, Kerby. And, you know, I've been with you by telephone many times, but this is the first time that I can remember, at least, certainly here, that we've been in the studio together.
Yes, well, and this is a new studio, so it looks pretty good, doesn't it?
It really does. It really does. And all the technology. And aren't you glad that somebody understands it?
I am, because I couldn't do all of this by myself, and want to thank Andrew, who is our engineer that makes this happen, Ivy, who's producing it, and of course your wife was here as well. And I got a few people watching the program. And by the way, if you happen to be in the Dallas area and would like to watch some of these interviews, you're free to do so. You're here in large part because next week all of us will be at the National Religious Broadcasters. Just the other day you were speaking to pastors at the Southern Baptist Convention. Is that correct?
Yes, the Southern Baptist Convention has a group called the Conservative Baptist Network.
Mm-hmm.
They feel that there's some slippage in the convention as a whole. So they had 1,000 pastors, and it was my privilege to speak at a breakfast for them. And what I did basically, Kerby, is I laid out 5 challenges that the church faces today. But it wasn't just challenges for the Southern Baptists. These challenges would have fit any denomination, any evangelical church. I mean, it had to do with issues of race and sexuality and all those things. The other thing that I've pointed out, Kerby, is that we are not passing our faith onto our children.
Well said.
You know, they are going a different direction. And in the book that we're talking about today, We Will Not Be Silenced, I have a chapter on the sexualization of children. And I point out that the cell phone in your teenager's hand will do more to inform his or her worldview than an hour of church and an hour of Sunday school. So if we're talking about the faith, we can talk about it now, but we have some huge challenges ahead. And parents need to be warned. They have to fight this battle on many different levels.
Well, again, this book is entitled We Will Not Be Silenced. It's 10 chapters, about 250 pages, published by our good friends at Harvest House. And one of the things that I think we will begin to able to find out is that some of those topics that you addressed before those pastors we'll be talking about today. And if you don't have a copy of the book, and I highly recommend it, almost everywhere I've gone, Dr. Lutzer, I mentioned we've been in radio rallies in Alaska and South Carolina and Georgia. In a couple of weeks, we're going to Alabama, Mississippi. I always mention your book because I think it is one of the 2 books I think that are so significant in terms of helping us understand what is going on in the culture. So if you'd like to get a copy, we do, of course, have a link to some of the information about Dr. Erwin Lutzer, but also a way for you to get the book either in paperback or Kindle. It may be in your local bookstore, but if not, you can get it right there by going to pointofview.net. First chapter talks about how did we get here? And I think that's a key issue because, Dr. Lutzer, we've been talking about critical race theory. We've been talking about classical Marxism. We talked about cultural Marxism. But it would be helpful for people to understand that we didn't just get here by accident. There were deliberate forces that actually brought about the world that we find ourselves in today, aren't there?
There really are. And, you know, you listed a number of them. Actually, the one that I begin with is cultural Marxism. People have to understand that when we talk about cultural Marxism, classical Marxism says that there has to be a revolution and it's primarily economic. But cultural Marxism says we can achieve the same goals and do it incrementally. So we can do it by capturing education, by capturing law, by capturing the media, by voting for the right people. We can bring about Marxism. And so it's important to understand that. And what I do in the book as you have already hinted at, I begin by talking about the vilification of our history, because the idea is that we have to destroy that on which America has been built so that we can build it on a different foundation. Our past is so tainted, it can't be redeemed. What we need is a new philosophy. And then I take it in, the tearing down of monuments and so forth, but also then we apply it to race. People have to understand that in Chicago, we've all heard of Saul Alinsky, but one of the things that he emphasized is that he could see that Marxism, and he was a committed Marxist, he could see that it could be applied to race. So the same kind of conflict you have between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat that Marx talked about, he could talk about if he were to put the races in different categories. So what you have is the whites and the blacks, and the oppressed, of course, are to overcome the oppressor. This is so critical for parents, and I appreciate so much being with you, because what parents need to understand is this: that those diversity studies in our university today are not intended to bring about harmony or even benefit. They are intended for perpetual conflict and blaming, with no hope for reconciliation.
And we will get to some of that, because that's chapter 3 in your book. But I thought just for a minute, in that first chapter, you not only talk about cultural Marxism, but the attack on the nuclear family. And it does seem... Go ahead.
And that even is Marx. Marx believed that the family was a unit of oppression. Remember this, for Marx, the whole key to history was oppression. Mm-hmm. So the family was a unit of oppression because, after all, wives oppress their husbands oppress their wives. Let me get that straight. Parents oppress their children. They took them to church. God was the ultimate oppressor. So Marx said that what we need to do is to make sure that we relieve people of oppression. And Kerby, people have to understand that this permeates our culture. Even the idea of, let's defund the police because, after all, the police are oppressors. Let's let people out of jail because jails are oppressive. The whole difference, and I hope that we get a chance to talk about this, the whole difference really has a lot to do with your view of human nature. If you believe that people are basically good and the only reason they do evil is because of oppression, then you're going to have one philosophy, namely the Marxist philosophy: just rid people of oppression and crime will decrease. But you and I know that the Bible teaches original sin. It's not just external oppression, it is internal compulsion to sin.
We'll come back and talk about the very different view of human nature. Also, the idea of rewriting history. We've talked about tearing down monuments. You talk about people like Howard Zinn rewriting the whole history of America and those kinds of things. And then we'll get into that whole idea of diversity and division and critical race theory. Does that show up in the church? We'll talk about that, too, and all sorts of other topics with Dr. Erwin Lutzer as we talk about his book, We Will Not Be Silenced, published by Harvest House. We have information about that on our website. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In our digital world, the major media organizations are allowed to shove inconvenient facts and headlines from the past down the memory hole. In the book 1984, The Memory Hole was a small chute leading to an incinerator. Winston Smith, while working at the Ministry of Truth, was given the task of throwing documents into the memory hole in order to create a forgery of the past. In a recent column, Michael Brendan Doherty reflects on how easy that has become in our digital world. He says, with the internet, there is no paper trail to burn. There is just code to update. A good example can be found in the Washington Post headline that appeared in February of last year. It referred to Senator Tom Cotton's conspiracy theory that has already been debunked. Recently, the headline was changed from debunked to disputed because the consensus has changed and the original headline was sent down the media memory hole. When I talked on radio about the way the media has given itself permission to change past inconvenient facts and headlines, I mentioned that we have always been told that the internet is forever. We We tell our children to be careful about what they post on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok. Someday, it will come back to haunt you since the internet is forever. One example is the story of Caleb Kennedy, a 16-year-old who dropped out of American Idol because of a video from 4 years ago. He was seated next to a friend wearing a hood that some people thought looked like the Ku Klux Klan. He wasn't dressed that way. His friend was dressed as one of the characters in The Strangers Pray at Night. And let me remind you, this video was made when he was just 12 years old. Unlike the Washington Post, Caleb didn't get to send that video down the memory hole, and that seems incredibly unfair. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have in studio with us today Dr. Erwin Lutzer, and as I've said before, one of those must-read books is We Will Not Be Silenced. And Dr. Lutzer, I was just telling you off-air just a while ago that I'm with my dentist 2 days ago, and he's talking about the book while we said, well, he's going to be in studio on Thursday. So I'm running into a number of people that have read the book. I have other people that when I mention it, I can see them writing it down and wanting to find out about that because they are trying to have a sense of what's going on in our society. And you talked just a minute ago, and it's really key to many of the things we've talked about in terms of constitutional interpretation, criminal justice, and all the rest. If you have one view of human nature that says that humans are basically good, then you're going to come out with a different set of conclusions about crime, about whether we should have checks and balances, whether or not race is an issue that's endemic and systemic and can never be dealt with. Or if you start with the idea of human sinfulness, you want to have protection against crime and protection against ambitious individuals, but you also have the hope of the gospel. And these are diametrically opposed views that determine, in many cases, the public policy that we talk about every single day.
Exactly. And people have to understand that. You know, if we think to ourselves that the real problem with people is oppression, now oppression can indeed produce crime. Nobody's denying that. But if we deny the doctrine of sin, the deceitfulness of the human heart, we will be led astray by very naive points of view. And if I might even give an example, you know, the whole point is that a certain race, you know, is very, racist, whereas others don't struggle with that. You know what I mean? In other words, I think that the answer even to the diversity that we're talking about is the cross of Jesus Christ, because the cross says that the differences between us are not that great. So we come to the foot of the cross, we receive forgiveness, and then we ask ourselves, what can we do to make things better? That's the question. And one of the things I told the pastors at the Southern Baptist Convention is this, that is the 1,000 that gathered, is that it is so important for us to realize we don't have to agree on everything to affirm our unity in Christ. When the Apostle Paul says in Colossians 3:11 that in Christ, imagine this, there's neither Jew nor Greek. We know that they had huge differences, circumcised or uncircumcised. And then he says barbarian. They acted barbarically, if there's a word like that. Barbaric, Scythian, they were marauders. bond or free, Christ is all and in all. Do you think they agreed on everything? Of course not. But yet they were able to affirm their unity. So the challenge of the church is to say that we might not agree on everything, but we are unified in Christ. The diversity studies always divide and destroy. To put it in a single sentence, Kerby, critical race theory tears apart what Jesus died to bring together. And the intention is to keep tearing it apart with perpetual conflict until supposedly the oppressed overcome the oppressors. And that's why it is so important when people begin to send their kids to university. I make the statement that kids today in university, they may not be talked out of their faith, but they'll be mocked out of it. In other words, you believe that, and so forth. And the reason I wrote this book is I also see that the church is being shamed into silence. We don't know quite what to do in the face of this barrage of everything that is happening in terms of the culture.
And that's, again, why the title is We Will Not Be Silenced, because let me, if I can, go to one of your other books, Hitler's Cross. There were times in which Christians were silenced by the Nazis. There are times when Christians were silenced by the communists. We've talked about Rod Dreyer's book, Live Not by Lies. And so in some respects, the challenge is different because it's almost easier when you see that the government's telling you not to believe. But when it's coming from more cultural forces and they're trying to make you feel comfortable and be part of the in crowd, that's the problem. The kids sometimes will stand up to a real challenge, but when you're just mocking them out of their faith, that's almost worse than trying to argue them out of their faith.
Kerby, you've put your finger on something that I desperately want to talk about, and that is propaganda.
Yes.
And the reason for this is Russia perfected it. And in Russia, when there was a dissident, and the state declared him to be a dissident, everybody else chimed in and said, we agree, even if they knew nothing about the person, because they all wanted to chime in. Today we call it the cancel culture. They called it something else. But the reason I thought of that is you mentioned Nazi Germany. In Germany, there were churches that put a swastika on their door, saying, in effect, when you come for the Christians, don't come for us because we are on your side. And today, of course, the watchword is woke. People are asking themselves, am I woke enough to be seen as virtuous? God help the person who's on the wrong side of woke.
Yes.
So what we have to do in the midst of all this, and then, of course, also it's the misuse of language. You've already hinted at that, how, Hitler called starving children, he called it putting them on a low-calorie diet, and killing the Jews was nothing less than cleansing the land and so forth. So what you do is this: when it comes to propaganda, I'll put it in a single sentence, you tell people what they want to hear, but you give them what you want them to have. And so you switch the meanings on them. But anyway, to your point, absolutely, the cultural pressure, I call it cultural streams. The cultural streams in our culture are so powerful, woe to the person who stands against them. And then, of course, you also add fear and hate, which becomes a part of it. And so everyone dances according to the same tune, goes in the same direction. But, today, elections do have consequences, as we know. Today, it's not only the culture that you reference, but it's also the fact that we have today legal challenges for our freedoms.
Right.
And legal challenges. Christian colleges are struggling mightily because of edicts that are coming down about the whole transgender phenomenon and how transgender students have to be accepted just like other students. Do you have a daughter?
I do.
Okay. Kerby, how would you like that daughter to be in the same room as someone who is born a male but now identifies as a female?
Yeah.
Can you imagine that? And yet that is being imposed, not just by culture, but even by law. So we're in a whole new ball game here. We have never been down this road before as a nation.
You know, you've been talking to the pastors there, but also I know that you will be speaking at the Alliance Defending Freedom conferences. And we, of course, on Fridays usually have somebody here from First Liberty Institute or some other individuals, maybe American Center for Law and Justice or whatever, because we are convinced, Dr. Lutzer, that the challenges in terms of religious liberty are at an all-time high. And so it's going to be important not only for pastors to speak with boldness, but for us to encourage people inside the church to stand for these issues in the legal system, or we will find ourselves very much like you've written about in the past of what happened in Nazi Germany, won't we?
Exactly. And law is really where the battle is at. Show me your laws, Kerby, and I will show you your God. If there is no law above the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court is God. If there's no law above you, then you are your own God. So many of the battles take place because of law. And, of course, you have the two forces. You have law, and then you have culture. But actually, I should say three forces, and that is the media. Mm-hmm. So the media drives all of this. It doesn't simply reflect the culture. It leads the culture. We all know that. It leads the culture. So you have these streams coming into our society, coming into where we are at in terms of students, and absolutely powerful. But here's the thing. It is so critical for people to understand that God has given us resources to stand against this.
Very true.
And what I argue in the book is, and by the way, each chapter has a response of the church, how I think the church should respond. Mm-hmm. But I would say this, that it is so critical for people to understand that we have to stand for truth and just take the consequences, because the real issue is not how we look on earth, it's how we look in heaven.
Well said. And again, 10 chapters that not only give you kind of action items, but things to pray about as well. And it is a book of about 250 pages. So we'll come back and maybe get into a couple of the other chapters. We are very concerned about the sexualization of our children. You have a chapter there about capitalism and socialism, and we'll talk about that. And also, you only mentioned Saul Alinsky. We need to get back to that. So we got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Erwin Lutzer, and his book is entitled We Will Not Be Silenced, subtitle Responding Courageously to Our Culture's Assault on Christianity. And Dr. Lutzer, if there's one word I've used maybe a little too much this year, it's the need for us to have discernment. But if there's a second word I've been using, it's that we need to have courage. And as we ended the last segment, it was just a reminder that there are going to be and are assaults on our Christian values, and they are coming after us in a variety of different ways, oftentimes especially to our children and grandchildren. So the subtitle, I think, is very important. We need to have courage, and there is a tendency right now for everybody to say, just go along, don't ruffle anybody's feathers, don't make waves, and we don't need to be obnoxious. We need to be gracious individuals, but at the same time, there are some lines drawn in the dirt, and everybody's trying to have us move those lines, aren't they?
They are, and you know what's so important, Kerby, is that people understand that they often have to do it alone. Others might not stand with them. You know, yesterday when I was speaking to a group of people, actually it was for David, well, his name doesn't come to me. He's the guy who does the finances, you remember?
Oh, sure.
I emphasized the fact that Caleb and Joshua, we remember them, right? But we don't remember the other 10 spies. Nobody remembers them. In fact, I said, I'll give you $100. Of course, I was talking about David Ramsey, by the way.
Yeah.
Nobody says, you know, we're going to remember the 10 spies. Well, you think of Luther. When he was standing there before the Diet of Worms, and he was standing there with Charles V and all of the princes of Germany, and he believed that if he did not recant, he would be put to death, and yet he chose not to recant. Now, he wasn't put to death for some interesting reasons, but the point was there weren't a lot of people coming out of the woodwork saying, yes, we agree with you. So I want to say to the parents today who are listening, or even the businessman, you may have to stand alone, and you might have to, pay for your obedience. I think I mentioned this also in the book. A school teacher in Chicago told me that he was told it is not enough for you to simply tolerate same-sex marriage. If you don't celebrate it, you could lose your job. Mm-hmm. All right, now let's ask the question, what do we do if he loses his job? Because that's a line in the sand. He can't celebrate what God has condemned. Well, the answer is this, Kerby, we're going to have to rethink church. People are going to have to come around him, and they're going to have to say, we're going to stand with you through this. We may even help you financially or whatever if you're able to get another job. But the point is, we need courage. And I don't think by nature, I certainly am not courageous, and I don't know about you, all of us. We don't want to get out there and be vilified on social media. In fact, in my book, an entire chapter is entitled Vilify, 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 which is the way in which things are settled today. No rational argument, no rationality here. Everything is vilification and anger. So that's the day in which we live. The internet has been a terrible, I know that it's a blessing. We all use the internet to get the gospel out. But in the other respect, it is terrible. Because the problem with social media is you can go and you can make accusations against a person that you don't have to prove. So people go there and they're angry about something and they spill all of this out, and it can be read immediately around the world. So here's my challenge to every single Christian. Are we going to be so frightened that we remain silenced, or are we going to speak and just take the consequences? That's the issue.
That's a very good one. Let's, if we can, even follow up on that, because when you talk about vilify, that's chapter 9 of your book, and you talk about Saul Alinsky. And for every one person that maybe knows who he is, there are probably dozens of others that don't, but they still follow the pattern, and the pattern is to identify an individual, marginalize them, and vilify them.
Yes.
And so while there are some that are actually those that have read Rules for Radicals, there are many others that are still doing it and don't even realize they're using the same kind of methodology.
And you and I, who have read Rules for Radicals, we know, of course, that he dedicated it to Lucifer, the first rebel who won his own kingdom.
Yes.
But anyway, he was a community organizer in Chicago, died in 1976, influenced some of our politicians whose names I won't take time to mention. But the point is, he said that what you have to do is to isolate, you're absolutely right, isolate the person and then attack them personally. And in this way, of course, you're going to intimidate them, you're going to gain followers and so forth. So once again, hate, if I might quote Adolf Hitler, Hitler said hate is much more powerful than mere dislike. So if we can get somebody, if we can get people to hate somebody, we can make a tremendous amount of progress. Hate and fear, absolutely essential as we think about the whole idea of propaganda and how to get a certain point of view. Hey, that's a good expression, isn't it? A certain point of view across. The difference is, of course, your point of view is a biblical point of view, and we're talking about points of view today that are not biblical.
That's for sure. Let's, if we can, since we mentioned it, I want to come back to the chapter on the sexualization of our children. Dr. Lutzer, just the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about these contentious school board cases. Some of them have to do with teaching critical race theory in the schools. Many of the others have to do with teaching that there's no difference between boys and girls. There was one individual fired because he refused to refer to a boy who now says he's a girl using a feminine pronoun, and people who came up and stood up for that. You have the whole LGBTQ issue. We're also basically teaching profanity and pornography in a lot of the curriculum, and so you have a whole chapter just talking about the attack on the innocence of our children.
And not only the attack, the question is, what do the parents do?
Yes.
And, you know, some of them are in a very difficult dilemma, because they feel that they have to send their kids to the public school. They can't afford homeschooling. They can't stay home and take care of their kids. Maybe they can't afford faith-based education. And so I urge them, don't throw your lambs to the wolves. You know, it is so important. Even if they attend a public school, you have to stay on top of them continually. You have to deal with the teachers. You have to deal with the curriculum. And you know what? The illustrations that you have given that are very recent about people really giving a good, powerful lecture to some of the school boards that we've seen on TV, that's a good example. Isn't it interesting that when somebody has the nerve to do it, everyone else begins to chime in and say, you know what? You've given us the courage to stand with you. So we need people out there who are courageous, who will lead the way for others who perhaps are not quite as courageous or quite as articulate. And we simply cannot allow this to go on. Now, I don't know in the state of Texas here, but I can tell you that in Illinois, the equity curriculum that was inaugurated a couple of years ago is just basically pornographic. And people have to understand this. The whole idea of the gender thing is intended to confuse children. They're supposed to experiment sexually. And, you know, the confusion, of course, is absolutely great. And that is the point. And it really goes back to Freud, who felt that no child should ever possibly be left behind when it comes to sexuality. They should enjoy it at all the different levels. And so what you have is a very pagan notion of sexuality, and that is being taught to our children. So all that we can do is to plead for a sanity on the part of parents, on the part of school boards, and say, don't allow your children to be taught that which is evil and destructive.
Going to take a break, but let me just mention, just the other day, we spent some time working our way through a template that we actually put together because Dr. Lutzer, just down the road from us, not even more 10 miles from us, there was a real pitch battle about critical race theory and all of the rest. And we talked them through and talked about this very long article that, first of all, recognized that we want to try to bring some light to this. And they found if they won't see the light, they'll feel the heat. And they still weren't paying attention, so they then began to publish the curriculum. And once people started seeing what was being taught in the schools, that got everybody attention. Then they started running people for the school board. They started replacing some of those individuals, and it was just an all-time success story. But it helped you understand that, like you said, the question is not what I should do, but what we should do. Once they gathered together, once they got some of that information out, once they first educated people and empowered them, it made a difference. So we have some great success stories, and if nothing else, a good call for discernment and courage. We'll come back and continue with Dr. Erwin Lutzer right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. Erwin Lutzer in studio with us today. If you find yourself saying you'd like to hear this again, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, download the one button that says listen, or if you'd like to watch it again, you can watch it either on our system or also it will show up fairly quickly on YouTube. And maybe you want to pass it on to some others, and maybe you can use this as a resource along with the book. Maybe if you'd like to teach about this, use the book in terms of teaching a Sunday school class. A lot of this is available to you to use in a video presentation. So all available at the website, pointofview.net. 250 pages published by Harvest House, Dr. Erwin Lutzer, 10 chapters, and we won't cover all of it, but I thought we'd cover a little bit on the issue of socialism and capitalism. Wrote this one, a little book a long time ago, just to talk about some of the answers to the criticism of capitalism. Then I felt I had to write another book on socialism to answer all the reasons that socialism was being proposed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and the rest. And you have devoted a whole chapter to that. A lot of people might think, well, you're a pastor. Why are you worried about economic issues? But in some respects, we should be concerned about these, shouldn't we?
We really should. And, the reason is we have to remember that America funds missions around the world. Whatever you may say about Americans, they are very generous, actually. America gives $400 billion a year to charity. Now, I've been to many countries of the world, certainly not all by any stretch of the imagination, but any ministries over there that are really preaching the gospel, almost all of them are funded by American funds. So one of the concerns that I have is if America goes down the tubes and goes down the socialist route, of course, all that has to come to an end. People have to understand that in socialism, you don't own the money that you earn. It is owned by the state. And the state has the privilege of divvying it up in accordance with the way in which they think would be fair or equitable. And so what begins to happen, obviously, it institutionalizes corruption. People say, well, socialism, capitalism is the disease, socialism is the cure. Well, obviously, there's corruption in capitalism because human beings are corrupt. But it's nothing in comparison to the kind of corruption that is in socialism, because socialism makes corruption necessary. Now, here's the thing. Have you ever noticed that socialists never talk about such a thing as creating wealth? What they always talk about is how to divide it.
Right.
So we should divide it here and we should divide it there. And the reason they never talk about making it is, strictly speaking, socialism cannot make money. And the reason, of course, is in order to create wealth, you need investment, you need ingenuity, you need ideas. In socialism, it's like a caste system. Once you are put into a certain box, that's where you stay. Rebecca and I were in the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s.
Yes.
And one of the things that I remember is that the doctors in the hospital were paid very little more than some of the workers in the hospital. And obviously, they had a great dearth of doctors. That is expected. But you see, that's what is required by income equality. Well, that's not the way the world works. I show in this chapter that the minute we begin to talk about the control of wealth and the control of wages, we discover that freedom has to be taken away. And of course, it does. And people need to understand that socialism, as Margaret Thatcher so accurately said, you remember her line, the problem with socialism is pretty soon you run out of other people's money. And that's exactly what happens. In Israel, there was a kibbutz that decided that they would run it on socialist principles. What that meant was that everybody got paid the same, of course, whether or not they slept in the morning and went to work late or not. After all, there has to be income equality. People took their dogs to the dining room because the food was free. They left the lights on because the lights were free. And they ended the experiment because they realized that socialism is a paradise for parasites. And so people need to understand that. And one other line before I quote Churchill, as I'm going to in a moment. Have you ever wondered, Kerby, why it is that mice die in mousetraps? It's because they don't realize why the cheese is free. Churchill said this. He said, the great vice of capitalism is the unequal distribution of blessings. But the great benefit and blessing of socialism is the equal distribution of misery.
Yes.
And it has to be this way until the money runs out. And then, you have some pious soul out there saying, well, in the book of Acts, didn't they have a socialist system?
Acts 4, yeah.
Yeah, of course not. Of course not. That's very clear. In fact, Peter even explained to Ananias and Sapphira, the land was yours. You could have sold it. You could have kept it. You could have kept the money. Your error was in your deception, in lying. That was the thing. Nobody was under any compulsion to give to somebody else to somehow equalize, an income. So what we need to do is to stand against socialism, because it rewards laziness, it rewards a lack of ingenuity, and we need to emphasize that America, and remember I was born in Canada, so I can say this now as an American. Of course, I'm an American citizen. God has raised up this nation to be able to fund ministry and evangelism. And that's, I think, why I grieve. It isn't just simply that something very selfish. I grieve because I see this great nation with its opportunities to help evangelize suddenly disappear.
If nothing else, this is a call to action. I might just mention the last chapter talks about strengthen what remains to wake up. And in some respects, you certainly diagnose the problem, you give solutions, but the biggest solution is the subtitle, Responding Courageously to Our Culture's Assault on Christianity. And so this is a book that I do recommend to so many of you. Dr. Erwin Lutzer has been with us. We will not be silenced. And if people want to contact you, we have some information so that they can, of course, follow you on radio and contact you maybe for speaking and other things. So that's all available, and it's on our website, pointofview.net.
Kerby, I just want to say a thank you to you for having me today, but more than that, as I've listened to your show from time to time, because of where I live, I cannot hear it regularly, but as I've listened from time to time, your insight and your ability to be able to diagnose the problem and the solution is extraordinary. Your friendship means a great deal to me.
Well, thank you so very much for being here. Dr. Erwin Lutzer, a good friend, and if you would like to know more about this book, We Will Not Be Silenced, we have information about it on our website. It's published by Harvest House. First of all, look for it in your local bookstore. We always like to support our bookstores, but if not, we have information so that you can get it in paperback or Kindle. If you find yourself saying, that went too fast, I want to hear it again, you go to the website right now. There's a couple of things. We have a button that says listen, and that will give you a chance to maybe just download a podcast. You can listen to it when you're running, jogging, doing exercises, doing housework, whatever. Or then we have a button that says watch, or simply you can go to our YouTube channel at Point of View Radio Talk Show and watch it again. And I would encourage you to send it on to some others. Maybe you've heard this and say, I think my pastor needs to hear that, or I know an elder or deacon in our church or a Christian leader that needs to hear this. Take the time to maximize this and send it on to others. But again, it's just been a privilege to have Dr. Erwin Lutzer in studio, but we have a lot more to cover. So we will take a break and we will be back with more right after this.
Can make a difference. Yes, we face big tech censorship, government overreach, biblical illiteracy, and many other ills. And while there's no single action to overcome them, no real-life Captain America to come to our rescue, it's a fact that everyday Americans, like you, are the key to turning things around. The biggest thing you have is that you care, and all you need is the encouragement and the will to stand up for what's right. Your gift of Point of View enables us to reach more people with the information and free resources they need to join you in making a real difference in our homes, at work, in our churches, and our communities. Some of our friends have put $55,000 on the table as a matching challenge. You give, they will match it. Make a difference today by visiting pointofview.net/difference or call 1-800-347-5151. Double your impact today. Make a difference by taking this first step. Pointofview.net/difference. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to talk about near-death experiences. It's a topic we haven't dealt with too often here on Point of View in the last couple of years, and yet going all the way back more than 40 years ago, I wrote a book called Life, Death, and Beyond, and I wrote it back then because there was all this information coming in from people like Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross about death and dying, also a book that came out by Raymond Moody, Life After Life, and which people were claiming to have these out-of-body experiences, and then coming back with various experiences that seemed to contradict the Bible. And so that was a study that I did years ago. Of course, from time to time, we have interviewed some people on the topic, but it's been a while since we've done so. So I thought it would be very appropriate in light of some of the films that have come out, some of the books that have come out, to delve into this once again. So we bring to the microphone Dr. J. Stephen Miller. He is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Kennesaw State University. He is also an individual that teaches on religious studies, death and dying, critical thinking. He is also the founder of Legacy Educational Resources, and we have information about that as well on our website. His book that came out a number of years ago, Near-Death Experiences as Evidence for the Existence of God in Heaven, and we bring him now to the microphone. So, Dr. Miller, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about how you kind of delved into this area. For my experience, it was because we started hearing people coming back and said, oh, I went to the other side and it's compulsory heaven for everybody. And all sorts of things seem to be suggesting that the Bible is really just a little too narrow. God is, in a sense, bringing everybody into heaven. And that was certainly, if you will, a conversation starter for that. But I know that you got involved in this because I think it was perhaps the film that came out, or even the book, Heaven is for Real. And you're like, really? Are there people making these kinds of claims? And so you took the time to really kind of dig into this idea of near-death encounters, didn't you?
I sure did. And let me just mention, first of all, how much I appreciate Point of View Radio and Probe Ministries for dealing with these type of hard questions and apologetics, because I actually committed my life to Jesus back as a sophomore in high school, which was about the same time that both of your ministries began. And I was the type person who, once I made a commitment, then I started having my questions, and I had to dig in, read both sides of issues. I went to 3 colleges, 2 graduate schools of different types. I just read like a God search. And I really needed evidences and to read both sides in order to retain my faith. So I appreciate you guys. But yes, I never, in all that time of study, never even ran across near-death experiences. It wasn't until about 10 years ago that a relative of mine said, hey, I want you to read this book, Heaven is for Real, and tell me what you think. And I read it rather reluctantly, thinking, well, it's just a person's testimony. What kind of evidence could that be? And I read it, and it was heartwarming, but I didn't know the family. It just didn't seem very strong evidence to me. But on the book, a physician said, like on the cover, he said, in my study of near-death experiences, this is consistent with many of the experiences I've found. And I thought, people have been studying this? So rather than just following stories from the Internet or stories that people claimed in best-selling books, I decided to delve into the academic research on near-death experiences, which has really accumulated since you were reading Moody's Life After Life.
And again, one of the things I thought was so interesting is as we began to develop that, and I helped Evangelical Film do a film and some things like that, we had some stories of Maurice Rawlings and a variety of others saying, oh, wait a minute, maybe there are some explanations. But let's get into this a little bit, because your typical near-death encounter usually involves a couple of elements. I think you've identified, if I remember right, about 15. But take us through what a typical kind of experience might be, because some of these are near-death encounters where they have an out-of-body experience. Others are deathbed experiences where they say something on their deathbed. And so what have you found? Because you've been digging into this for many years. And what are some of the common elements?
Well, it's really amazing that there are any common elements, considering people's expectations and worldviews differ so much worldwide. But there are pretty definable things that tend to happen when somebody, let's say they had a cardiac arrest, cessation of breathing, cessation of heartbeat. And so really they shouldn't be able to sustain consciousness or lay down memories in a state like that. But then they'll come back when they're resuscitated and tell of extremely vivid encounters to where they went to the other side. They noticed themselves laying on a table outside of their bodies. They may have seen a light in the corner of the room, may have gone through a tunnel once they were following that light, experienced great peace, great joy, total cessation of any...
And I guess we've lost him there, but we'll see if we can get him back. And so, obviously, they will many times travel through a long, dark tunnel. They'll have an out-of-body experience. Sometimes there'll be a time in which they find themselves seeing a being of light, and sometimes they will identify that being as God or something else. So we'll come back and continue our conversation with J. Steve Miller. But again, he's been looking at a lot of the research that has been done, much of it since I wrote my book years ago. For the last almost 40 years now, you've had academics, you've had medical personnel, and others studying some of these issues of near-death encounters. And, of course, we want to take the time to kind of evaluate those, because can we come up with physiological explanations? Well, I think we can. Sometimes there's a lack of oxygen, what's called cerebral anoxia. Or are there pharmacological explanations? Sometimes drugs are administered in a ER or something like that, or there may be other chemical experiences because they were drug users or something of that nature. So we can come up with, obviously, physiological explanations and psychological explanations and pharmacological explanations. And so then what about this? Are these like dreams or hallucinations and those kinds of things? So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll connect up again with Dr. Steve Meyer. And again, this is a book that he has written many years ago, but you might want to get a copy. We do have a link there. Near-Death Experiences as Evidence for the Existence of God in Heaven. And as you can kind of tell, he came to this with a level of skepticism, which I think is good, because when you have somebody say, well, I had this experience, okay, it's an experience, but does the experience correlate with what we know in the Bible? And I've had all sorts of people tell me some incredible experiences. As a matter of fact, once you start speaking on this topic, I found years ago that those are individuals that then tell you their story, or they hear a story that someone else told. And of course, there have been some best-selling books and even some movies based upon some of this. So we want to apply a little bit more critical thinking to all of that. And that's one of the reasons why we have Dr. Mill joining us today, and that's why we have information that you might want to obtain by going to the website pointofview.net. Lost the connection. I think we've made it back again, and we will talk with Dr. Miller right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In our digital world, the major media organizations are allowed to shove inconvenient facts and headlines from the past down the memory hole. In the book 1984, The Memory Hole was a small chute leading to an incinerator. Winston Smith, while working at the Ministry of Truth, was given the task of throwing documents into the memory hole in order to create a forgery of the past. In a recent column, Michael Brendan Doherty reflects on how easy that has become in our digital world. He says, with the internet, there is no paper trail to burn. There is just code to update. A good example can be found in the Washington Post headline that appeared in February of last year. It referred to Senator Tom Cotton's conspiracy theory that has already been debunked. Recently, the headline was changed from debunked to disputed because the consensus has changed and the original headline was sent down the media memory hole. When I talked on radio about the way the media has given itself permission to change past inconvenient facts and headlines, I mentioned that we have always been told that the internet is forever. We tell our children to be careful about what they post on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok. Someday, it will come back to haunt you since the internet is forever. One example is the story of Caleb Kennedy, a 16-year-old who dropped out of American Idol because of a video from 4 years ago. He was seated next to a friend wearing a hood that some people thought looked like the Ku Klux Klan. He wasn't dressed that way. His friend was dressed as one of the characters in The Strangers Pray at Night. And let me remind you, this video was made when he was just 12 years old. Unlike the Washington Post, Caleb didn't get to send that video down the memory hole, and that seems incredibly unfair. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with Dr. Miller as we are talking about these near-death encounters. Unfortunately, we lost the phone connection, but Dr. Miller, if you're still with us, talk a little bit more about what are some of the common elements of these near-death experiences and some of these deathbed experiences.
Well, I think when we got cut off, we were in heaven having a life review. That is one of the typical elements, and interestingly, even if a person's just out of it with a cardiac arrest for a few minutes, they'll come back speaking of going through their entire lives, looking over with a being of light, which seems to be God, their lives. And then there's often a time when at the end they have to make a decision as to whether to come back or not. And then they find themselves back in their body. So those are the common elements of a near-death experience. While I was studying these, and again, I was not just reading the paperback reports, I was reading the studies of these, which have been done through the years, but I came across another similar experience, which is when a person is approaching their final death. And that would be called a deathbed experience, when someone on their deathbed begins saying, hey, I'm seeing angels on the other side and deceased relatives, and it's extremely vivid. In fact, a recent study in a New York hospice by doctors there found when they interviewed patients every day, they found that over 80% of them were having these very vivid experiences with seemingly the afterlife, or at least another dimension where they were going. So these are very life-changing experiences, both for those who study them and those who have them. And I think as Christians, we need to have answers when people tell us about these experiences.
I think so. And again, the deathbed experiences, those have been documented for some time because we have some of these great stories that have been told about some of the great saints as well as some of the atheists. And so that's been the case. But the near-death encounters, because oftentimes we can resuscitate people, to make the point you made just a minute ago, these are stories and these are articles that are appearing in the journal Psychiatry, the Lancet, the Journal of Psychology. There's even a Journal of Near-Death Studies, the American Journal of Psychiatry. So we're talking about, if you will, referenced and refereed articles, academic kinds of articles, and we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of these, aren't we?
At the time I was writing and researching for this book, I'd found there were over 900 articles on near-death experiences that had been published in scholarly literature, the type that you mentioned. Some of our top medical journals, 55 researchers or teams had published at least 65 studies of over 3,500 near-death experiences. So I often find that when you go into the actual research, what they're doing, you'll have cardiologists like Dr. Sabom at Emory University who really didn't believe in these things, and he began interviewing his patients and was shocked to find out that they reported such experiences. And he said, "Why didn't you ever tell me about these?" They said, "You'd be the last person I would tell about something like that," because, of course, they'll think he would think they're crazy and send them to the psych ward. And but when somebody like that, like a cardiologist, is interviewing people, there's little reason for people to be lying about these things. When somebody's trying to sell a best-selling book, there have been cases where people just made up stories in order to sell books.
Yes.
So, but in Sabom's case and others, Sabom and Van Lommel in Holland that was interviewing their patients, there's really a lot of reasons to not share the experience and very little reason to lie to somebody because they really don't have anything to get out of that.
Let's talk about the state of these individuals, because just the other day, one of the first times I think I've ever talked about UFOs, okay, we can set aside the person that thinks he saw a UFO because he'd been drinking all night and driving down a country road, but we can't dismiss the individual that is with the Navy who is an expert in identifying aircraft and saying, I'm seeing things I've never seen before. This is the same sort of thing. Yes, there are probably some individuals that because of a lack of oxygen, what's called cerebral anoxia, or maybe because there were certain drugs administered or because they were doing drugs, had some kind of vision. But you're talking about individuals pretty much that are sane, intelligent, matter of fact, a little bit reluctant to share this because they don't want people to think they're crazy, but nevertheless have had some kind of valid experience. True? And again, we seem to have lost him. So this is getting to be a little bit of a difficulty, but we'll see if we can get him back on the program once again, because one of the concerns that we have is that if we want to evaluate these, first of all, we need to separate out some of those particular issues and some of those particular individuals that maybe aren't the most reliable eyewitnesses and the reliable testimonies. But at the same time, I think we can recognize that some of the stories that individuals are telling seem to have some validity to those. And so we want to come back and look at some of the different lines of evidence and some of the things that he has investigated as well. And most importantly, why is it even important to talk about this? Because I think, first of all, you've already heard us address the idea that if you're in any kind of ministry, and I would certainly speak right now to our pastors and Sunday school teachers and others, you're going to hear some of these stories. And so what do you do with it? And so this is one of the reasons why oftentimes his book has been used in some of the college courses at places like Biola, some of these seminary classes like at Talbot and others, just to give people a little bit bit of a sense of what you might want to say when you run into those. And then more importantly, back to the subtitle of his book, is this evidence for the existence of God and heaven? And so once again, I think we have Dr. Miller with us, and I'll try to figure out why we keep losing you. But if nothing else, it illustrates that these stories come from individuals that are pretty sane, pretty intelligent. And while we can eliminate some people that maybe were on drugs or maybe are facing a lack of oxygen or maybe even having some hallucination because they're taking a particular drug, there are just enough of these stories that actually deserve attention, and one of the reasons they show up in these academic journals.
Yes. In fact, it's not. They actually screen for these type things when they're doing the studies. If they find out someone has psychiatric issues in their background, they will take them out. If they were on drugs, they will say, "Oh, we won't consider this person's interview to be valid." So they are screened for these things, and this is very different from the little popular things that you see.
And so, again, why can't some people just say, well, this is just an exotic dream, or it's just a hallucination or something like that? You've identified some lines of evidence for why you believe that these are valid experiences.
Well, let me refer to Dr. Saboom, who I think did one of the best studies after he read Moody's or went to a seminar where Moody's evidence was given. He said, I just don't believe in these, and he went to study his patients. Now, he fully believed, he was a professor of cardiology at Emory University School of Medicine, and he fully believed that there was just a psychological explanation for all this. But what he did is divide up his patients into those who claimed to have had a near-death experience and those who did have cardiac arrest but did not have a near-death experience. And he asked both groups of people, what happened during your resuscitation? Because resuscitations aren't just like they are on TV shows. They differ a lot. And so he found that the people who claimed to have seen their bodies from outside of themselves were consistently right in their description, and the people who did not have a near-death experience, did not leave their bodies, were almost always wrong in several main aspects. And so his conclusion was, these people are really, it took him about a year to come to this conclusion, but he said, these people are out of their bodies. They're claiming to have seen things that they couldn't have known otherwise. So that's one line of evidence. There's also the realer than real aspect of it. I mean, the way I'm a philosopher, and the reason I know that I'm talking to you now rather than dreaming is it's more real than a dream. But people, very sane people, go, have one of these experiences, and they come back saying, I remember someone who worked at my church. Most people never talk about these experiences, but he had an experience. My pastor referred me to him, and I talked to him. He was a minister of men, and he had an experience when he was near death. A sepsis had happened to his body, and he was very close to death. And he told about going and talking to some angelic figures on the other side about whether to come back or not, and he knew he was going to come back and live. But I asked him, I was sitting across from a table from him, and I said, just how real was this experience? Was it, kind of like a vivid dream? He said, no, it was real. And he just reached across the table and looked at me. He said, it was real. It was as real as me talking to you right now. No, it was realer than this.
We'll take a break and continue our conversation right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps you have some comments or questions. We'd love to hear from you in that regard. We also have a link to jstevemiller.info. It's on our website. You don't have to remember all that because that gives you some information about him. Of course, we have information about the book that came out in 2012. And so you can get it in paperback or Kindle. But most importantly, I think you might have some comments or questions. And if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Miller, let's, if we can, come back to that for just a minute, because I remember from my studies, even 40 years ago, we had some situations in which people, because they had these out-of-body experiences, not only could report what happened inside the operating room, but conversations that took place outside of the operating room. You had examples of people that were born blind who then, when they had this out-of-body experience, actually could see things in the lab. They could see the colors, and sometimes they could even report some things that were said or done that shouldn't have been done. So there are, I think, just sort of independent ways to verify that something is going on, and for our atheist friends to just dismiss all of that as nothing more than a hallucination or some vivid dream just doesn't stand the test of some kind of critical thinking, does it?
Well, I think that's true. You look at the case of Pam Reynolds, which Dr. Sabaum took a good bit of time to research. She was undergoing a risky brain surgery that required lowering her body down to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, draining all the blood from her head by 3 primary tests: a silent EEG, unresponsive brain stem, no flow of blood to the brain. She was clinically dead. Yet after the surgery, she reported being very much alive during the surgery, viewing it from outside of her body. She described in accurate detail a conversation that transpired during the surgery and specialized instruments that were used. In fact, Sabaum had to request a picture of the instrument that was used because he wasn't familiar with it. She had said it looked kind of like the shape of a toothbrush or whatever, that was actually a drill. And it was exactly what she had described. And her eyes were taped shut. She was deeply anesthetized. 100 decibel clicks assaulted her ears to monitor brainstem activity. So, I mean, if you take two hypotheses and say, okay, a naturalistic hypothesis, well, could it have been the lack of oxygen to the brain? Well, why would she have seen and heard these things that could not have been heard naturalistically through a physical brain? It just seems like a spiritual hypothesis makes more sense than any naturalistic hypothesis.
What about the fact that in some of these cases, people have an experience, but then they, of course, reinterpret it? In other words, there is some cultural differences. When people say they saw a being of light, some say, well, that was God, or that was the Virgin Mary, or Yama, the Lord of Death, that they were Hindu or something like that. So it could be that they're having a common experience, but they're reinterpreting it. There's another possibility, and that is, after all, if we're going to be honest, Satan is described as an angel of light, a being of light. So is it not possible that they could have seen something that is true, but actually contrary to the Bible? What about that?
I agree with both of the things you just said. There are... Okay, so let's say that you have a person in the United States who sees a messenger on the other side, some kind of a messenger from God. We would call that an angel. If somebody were in India or an area similar to that, they may call it a Yamadut, because that's what a messenger from the gods would be called there. They may be seeing exactly the same thing, but describing it in the terms that they know. Often when I've heard things about differences in culture, I would hear that, oh, well, people in India don't report going through a tunnel, and so why would it not be the same? But when I went on Dr. Long's site where people share their experiences, I looked at about 3,000 of these experiences and tried to find the ones that were from cultures very different from the United States. When I did that, I looked at the ones in India, and they were reporting going through tunnels. So I think we need a little more research on some people's parts. Maybe they're not asking the right questions when they talk to people. I think the second thing you said is very important. One of my most respected theologians was Robertson McQuilkin at Columbia International University.
Oh, yes.
He wrote some books on biblical interpretation, and he had a saying. He'd say it's easier to go to a consistent extreme than to stay in the center of biblical tension. Now, to me, when you're talking about visions and experiences such as this, often people will go to an extreme and say, okay, they're all made up or of the devil. And I'll say, well, do you know that? Does the Scripture say that? They accused Jesus of casting out demons by the ruler of demons. It's kind of a dangerous thing to just say this is all of the devil if you don't know that. The other extreme is, these are real, and you just accept everything you hear and start building your theology of the afterlife from a bunch of stories. But obviously, biblically speaking, there are true prophets, and then there are false prophets. There are true preachers, there are false preachers.
Yes.
There are true miracles of God, there are false miracles. So we're going to expect, with any experience so powerful, that there's a mix of legitimate and not legitimate experiences. Some people have mental illness, and we don't know it. Well, we don't just believe everything we hear. According to Proverbs, the fool believes everything he hears. So I think there's a balance. We don't believe all of them, but is there really biblical evidence enough to say that none of these can be of God?
I want to come back to kind of the spiritual implications of that, but let's take some phone calls along the way because some of them are getting back to some of these reports. So let me take one phone call from California in Fresno. And, Michelle, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. What's your question?
Hi, just 2 minutes.
Turn your radio down, please.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, they had an interesting conversation about how would you go on a degradation of a actual injury happening due to conversation. You barely hear that, not looking or wanting to be part of knowing, but it's like say someone has imbalance due to outreach terminology of being accepted as far as going along the way and not interact with someone to tell them that they're like compliment, in other words, like you were speaking about a second ago.
Sure. Again, what about that? Because, you've got some people that say, I told my doctor, and but the doctor didn't want to believe that. And in some respects, Steve, that's sort of how you started this whole conversation out. There may be more stories out there, but as soon as somebody even dares to tell their cardiologist or their oncologist, the guy says, well, you won't believe what this crazy person said in the hospital. And that's as far as it goes. So there seems to be a need for getting some more of this information out because I suspect there are more examples than even the ones documented in some of the research that you've been doing.
I think that's true, and this is one reason that so much research has been done, because we've developed specialists in dealing with people who are dying. Hospice deals with that. Geriatrics deals with that. And they need to know what to do as professionals, as nurses and doctors, when somebody claims to have these visions. Do you adjust the morphine? Do you just calm them down and try to get them back to reality? So it's a very practical problem. I'll tell you, over and over and over and over in these studies, the end of it, they will say, don't dismiss these. Don't change the subject. This is very important to this person. Take them seriously. Ask them more, because typically, even as individuals, when we're watching relatives die, if they mention seeing some type of vision, in the Western culture, we just kind of get embarrassed and shut it down. I think often God is trying to get somebody's attention to make sure that they can get things right at the very end. He's patient toward us. He loves us. He wants to give us good experiences. And God ministers to us when we're going through the valley of the shadow of death. I think often he'll give people experiences with the other side so they don't have to deal with the problems that come with our body and the pains that come with death. So, yes, we need to take these seriously, and that's what all these, and I'm talking about in secular journals, they're saying take them seriously no matter what you think about them. Listen to them. Ask them for more. This is important.
Let's, if we can, when we come back from the break, then try to provide a Christian perspective on some of this. We sort of done a little of that, but 2 Corinthians 11:14, Satan is actually described as an angel of light. The next verse goes on to say his associates are sometimes emissaries of righteousness. And so is there a possibility of a spiritual counterfeit taking place? These are all experiences that some of which seem very valid, but these argue for universalism. Is everybody going to heaven? And is there any kind of counterfeit there? So we'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, we'll take some more phone calls, but let me just mention that the first hour we had Dr. Erwin Lutzer in studio. Today we have Dr. Steve Miller. And if you find yourself saying, boy, there's just a lot of information here that I've never heard before, and I really appreciate that, I hope you'll go to our website, pointofview.net. There's a banner that says, Be a Difference Maker. We really want to encourage you to make a difference in your community. But most importantly, there's a button that says, Give Now. And I hope that you'll consider what you might do to support this ministry, because today I suspect you've been hearing a lot of things you've not heard before. And if you value that and believe that that's the kind of information that you would like to hear in the future and you'd like to have others hear, hope you'll consider what you might do to support this ministry. Let me take another phone call, and we're going to get into the whole issue of spiritual counterfeit. But we'll go to South Carolina this time, Columbia, South Carolina. Dawn, you're on with Dr. Steve Miller.
Hi. I'm a retired registered nurse, and I woke up bolt upright in the bed one night with a patient just clearly on my mind. No further information, just alarmed, awake with that patient on my mind. And a couple of days later, I returned to work and found out that the patient had a near-death experience, and he was okay, but he told me that he saw me in his out-of-body experience, and I asked him what time the event happened, and it was the exact time that I woke up in the middle of the night like that. So I was wondering if you have any cases of independently verified situations related to the topic.
Dr. Miller?
Oh, yes. Okay, this is one of the most exciting parts of my study. After I studied near-death experiences and wrote that book, I went ahead to get my Ph.D. there in Columbia, South Carolina, Columbia International University, and I studied these deathbed experiences. Let me tell you one from a relative of mine. I was studying for my original book. A relative came by whom I greatly respect, history professor or teacher all of his life, had a master's degree, and Mom said, tell Bucky what you're studying. I said, I'm studying near-death experiences. He said, oh, let me tell you about mine. And here's somebody that I know, that I trust. I'm not reading from afar. And he said one night he felt like a huge weight had hit his chest, like a heart attack. He came out of his body, saw a tunnel of light in the corner of the room, saw some angelic beings, immediately went back into his body, woke up in a cold sweat. Immediately the phone rang, and it was somebody in a distant town, I believe about 100 miles away, saying that his dad had just died of a heart attack. Now, that's called a shared death experience or a crisis apparition. These were studied by some of the top people at Cambridge University. They studied, they surveyed 17,000 people, intelligent people in the areas of Cambridge and Oxford. William James at Harvard was also a part of this study. And they found that about 10% of the population had experiences where they had seen someone, like your case, that was not physically there. Most of these were crisis apparitions where they knew that someone had died. They saw a visitation from someone who had died. So the people who were the authors of this study looked at the incidence of that in a 24-hour period in which the person died and found that there was 440 times more reports of this than should be if it were a purely chance thing. So that's going to be my next book where I'm talking about those type experiences. But, yes, that has been studied. Why don't we know these things? And these were very well-done studies.
So, Don, you brought it up, shared death experience. So you've had one, and maybe you'll end up in the next book by Dr. Miller. So thanks for sharing that today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, but one of the things that caused me concern 4 decades ago is everybody saying, hey, it's a compulsory heaven for everyone. And no, it's not. I mean, some of these experiences are not positive. But what about this idea of maybe there being a spiritual counterfeit or something like that? Can you speak to that, Dr. Miller?
Well, kind of as I said, I would assume that there are going to be spiritual counterfeits, just as there are true prophets, there are false prophets, just as there are true miracles, there are false miracles. So if I'm the devil, I'm going to try to make counterfeits and make people believe lies. That's why we need to not believe everything we hear, and we need to stay more of the serious studies of these rather than just believing everything we hear over the Internet. Now, toward the beginning, the early research, typically, they didn't really talk much about the hellish experiences or distressing near-death experiences. But since then, they're very much found and acknowledged in the literature. Maybe up to 30% or so of them are not just heavenly experiences. And I would like to emphasize that just because somebody has an experience with a good God and a good situation in their experience, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to heaven any more than a hellish experience would prove that you're going to hell. I think God's giving people what they need, and since the love of God leads us to repentance, many people are seeing the other side and for the first time are realizing, my goodness, I need to seek God. And that's exactly what Sabom found in his second study called the Atlanta study, was that he followed up on his patients, and they tended to be seekers. They tended to get involved in church and read their Bibles. Penny Sartori in her PhD dissertation found the same thing. I think these are not a final death. These are like a halftime checkup, and they cause people to seek, to see there is a loving God, there is an afterlife, and they rearrange their priorities and begin seeking.
Dr. Miller, just before we run out of time, we have a link to jstevemiller.info, and that's a place where they can learn a little bit more about near-death experiences, deathbed experiences, some of your books and interviews, but also about you in case they would like to, for example, have you come and speak, or maybe they have an experience they'd like to share with you that you could use in a future book. So there are all sorts of different ways in which people can contact you. You're in the state of Georgia, but you've made it pretty easy for a lot of our listeners to maybe schedule you to speak or to hear more about that. So what will they find when they land on your website?
Well, they'll find some of my past books and a little more, as you said, about me. I do have an email address there. If somebody doesn't have enough money and you want the book, I'll send you a free PDF. I'm not doing this for money or for fame. This has been important for me. It's reassured me of a lot of the things about the Christian life and about following God. I just want to pass it on to others, so feel free to contact me.
Well, again, we have a link to your website. We have information about you. We also have the book, which it's been out for many years, so it'd probably be harder to find in a bookstore, so that's a place where people can order it. And we have all of that at our website, pointofview.net. And if people wanted to pass this on to someone else, they can click on the button that says listen or watch. Even on your website, I think you've got another interview that you did with our good friend Sean McDowell. So all of that you can pass on to others in case that would be of help to them or to you. So it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. And Dr. Miller, been great to have you on the program, and look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kerby. Thanks for all you do.
We are going to take a break, and then tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. Okay, I've postponed all sorts of things happening in the news today, but we'll pick up on those tomorrow. We'll have Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews. Lots of things to cover. Penna Dexter's done a commentary. Of course, my commentary's out there today, and his latest article is there, so all sorts of material that we will be covering. Of course, we've had the G7 meeting. We have a comment or two from the Federal Reserve about inflation and monetary expansion. What's that going to mean to your family? So we just have a lot to cover tomorrow. I don't know how we're going to get it into 2 hours, but we will do our best. So again, if you find yourself saying, I want to go back and listen to either of these interviews with Dr. Lutzer or Dr. Miller, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. It's a service we provide to you. And don't forget to maybe click on that button that says Be a Difference Maker and support this ministry. I want to thank Andrew and Ivy for their help behind the scenes. We want to thank you and encourage you to join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
You can make a difference. Yes, we face big tech censorship, government overreach, biblical illiteracy, and many other ills. And while there's no single action to overcome them, no real-life Captain America to come to our rescue, it's a fact that everyday Americans like you are the key to turning things around. The biggest thing you have is that you care, and all you need is the encouragement and the will to stand up for what's right. Your gift of Point of View enables us to reach more people with the information and free resources they need to join you in making a real difference in our homes, at work, in our churches, and our communities. Some of our friends have put $55,000 on the table as a matching challenge. You give, they will match it. Make a difference today by visiting pointofview.net/difference or call 1-800-347-5151. Double your impact today. Make a difference by taking this first step. Pointofview.net/difference and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.